Today's film serves as a sliver of hope regarding the triumph of good versus evil, and also a dire warning against the true dangers of street magicians. Howdy, I'm Jeff Goldsmith, and this is the Q&A. My agenda is simple. Each week, I plan to bring you in-depth insight into the creative process of storytelling. Folks, I got to tell you, I absolutely love today's film, Black Phone. And as a magician myself, damn it, I was not pleased to see a magician serial killer, but it's okay because I've decided he's truly not one of us. He would not be in any recognized magic society, and it is a good warning to those kids. Don't hop in a van to see a magic trick pretty much ever, I think is the way to put it. But, today's guest could tell us more about how a magician ended up in this movie as a serial killer, because we have director and co-writer Scott Derrickson and co-writer Robert Cargill. This is a complicated story. There's a mystery. There's supernatural elements. There's a ticking clock. A lot could have gone wrong. Luckily, it did not. And that's why I'm so grateful that Cargill and Derrickson were so generous with their time in talking us through how they wrote this film. And speaking of things to dig, Backstory Magazine turns 10. That's right. We survived a decade and we couldn't have done it without your help. And the other good news is that we just released a new issue. Yes, issue 47, our summer issue, is live. And there is so much great stuff in it. I hope you check out the table contents to see it all. But we have Emmy Awards contenders ranging from Stranger Things, Better Call Saul, Station 11, Barry, Hacks, and What We Do in the Shadows, to summer movies, to new scripts for you to read, to an interview with director John Carpenter on the 40th anniversary of The Thing. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that in Backstory Magazine, we have a Cargill and Derrickson interview that has a whole bunch of different topics that are not covered in today's podcast. Yes, we do that on purpose. So you will get a lot more about the personal stories that were important for Derrickson to infuse into his film, amongst a bunch of other things. Plus, we have an interview with Joe Hill, the writer of the short story that became this film, as a completely separate interview. So we've got a lot of great new stuff regarding the Black Phone in Backstory Magazine as well. If you have never read us before, you can, of course, test drive us over at backstory.net and read the free issue, or you could use the iPad app Backstory, where you could read the free issue there as well. And if you like what you see, and I hope you do, you could consider becoming a subscriber. And to sweeten the deal, I want to give you discount coupon code SAVE5. That will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription. The code will work at backstory.net, and you enter it there in your checkout cart, but it'll give you access to both backstory.net and the iPad app as well. So, it's 2 for 1. You get access to both easily. But look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube channel, which is all the Zoomcasts go of these interviews. So you could see us do the interviews. You don't have to just hear us, but it would really mean a lot to me to have you subscribe to my passion project. So thanks for considering. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right into our conversation with co-writer director Scott Derrickson and co-writer Robert Cargill about their latest film, The Black Phone. I absolutely love your film. It's great to see you guys.
Oh, thank you.
We're going to start spoiler free, and I'm just giving us a timeline really quick about when you first came aware of Joe's story for Black Phone, and then the path towards realizing you were going to adapt it. I know it's a series of years.
Well, I first read the story when the month it was published in 2005, I believe. And I just wandered into a bookstore, pulled it off the shelf. It was in the section of new horror fiction. And of course, I didn't know who Joe Hill was. Nobody did. Nobody knew he was Stephen King's son. And it was the first thing he had published. So I stood there. I read the first story called Best New Horror and thought that was an amazing short story. So I bought the book, read it. And from that time on, of all those great stories in that anthology, I thought The Black Phone was a movie. It just felt like a movie to me. And I always had it in the back of my mind. And when Cargill and I started working together, I had him read it. And we kicked the idea around for a couple of years and just never really knew how to expand it until we sort of figured out how to do it. And then we wrote it pretty quickly.
It's interesting that you talk about how to expand it, in which there's a danger sometimes that comes with adapting a short story, in which sometimes the adaptation can become bloated because there isn't enough there for a movie. You both did a fantastic job of making this filmic, cinematic, exciting on every level. What were some of the challenges? And we'll talk more distinctly in the spoiler section, but what were some of the first hurdles that you had to overcome in order to make this a movie rather than a short story?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing is what Scott was just talking about. Like, you know, the short story is very much a second act. You know, it had very, very little third act. And no first act at all. There's really no backstory on Finney except the descriptions of playing baseball, you know, and his connection with Bruce Yamada. And so it's a great short story, but as a adaptation, it's just a hook for a story. It is just the bare bones. And so what we really needed was character. We needed flavor. We needed a setting. We needed to, where is that basement? Where did Finney grow up? Who is, you know, this character? And that's where Scott, you know, talked to me about wanting to do a film based on his childhood and based on, you know, many of the things he endured and set in, you know, Denver in the 1970s. And in talking, we realized, wait, that's everything that's needed here. What if we take all of that and this movie you want to make about this, the story you want to tell, and we put that onto Black Phone? And once we had that, all the pieces just started falling into place. I think the biggest hurdle, the one time Scott and I had to sit down and go, okay, let's work this out. Let's really talk this through and kick around a lot of ideas, was figuring out all the things that Finney has to do to try to escape from the basement, like those actual mechanics and getting those to work in the way that it functions in the movie. That was the thing I think was the most complicated and technical of it. But everything else just fell into place. Scott had so many great, interesting memories from his childhood that he wanted to express. And we knew he had this relationship with his sister, and she just kind of came to life in that script organically. And, you know, creating the ghost, it just, everything started falling into place. And it was such a fun experience writing this together that we were just having a blast creating this stuff. And it was just all coming out of us. And it happened very quickly.
Well, the texture that you got from the 1970s really resonated. I'm a kid from Kansas City growing up in the 70s. And honestly, you had something in the movie I hadn't thought about since I was a kid, in which sometimes near an elementary school or a school, so that kids wouldn't walk through people's yards and backyards, they built this fenced in walkway that were between houses that often had shrubberies around it. And the kids are walking through those a bunch. And honest to God, I hadn't seen one of those since I was a kid.
And it wasn't just chain link fences, but it was the chain link fences with the sharp cross, you know, barbed pieces at the top.
Yeah.
So that they also weren't easy to climb over.
That was great. That was a great touch. You know, I just want to talk about your partnership. When you sit down to write something, how important is outlining to your creative habits?
It depends. No two projects is the same with me and Scott. Every project we work on is radically different. Sometimes one of us takes lead and goes off and the other is acting as support. Sometimes it's a real strong 50-50. There are times where Scott's like, all right, I've got this, and will hand me an outline. And then sometimes we fly by the seat of our pants. And
so on this in particular, like, were
this
you
was
guys
outlined
in the same room?
Yeah, no, this one needed to be outlined because, you know, it is a tightly structured story. The challenge of it was actually twofold, because the first part was what Cargill said, which is, what is Finney going to do in this basement, you know? And not only what is he going to do, but how do these efforts have a payoff in the end so that it doesn't feel just episodic? Like, you know, he tries to get out and he doesn't, tries to get out and he doesn't. It may feel that way during the movie, but you find out in the end, well, there's more to it than that. And I think that the other part was structuring a first act, which is the biggest challenge of the movie, both in the writing and in the filmmaking. How do we get the audience to fall in love with these two kids and really care about the bond between this brother and sister? That's the heart of the movie. And we only had, I mean, they get split up on page 26 of the script, I think. And at 26 pages to create an emotional relationship, two characters that we care about and their bond, and make it so strong that it carries the rest of the movie, because the rest of the movie is still about that bond between the two of them. The whole time you're hoping that Gwen can find him in time, or that Finney can escape, and you're afraid that she won't, you know, and that he's going to meet the same end as the other kids. And so I think that getting that first act just right was not easy.
It's a pitch perfect first act in which you're doing a lot of world building. You're setting up things that are very important for the rest of the movie, and we're going to get to it in a second. But just sticking on your creative habit for a second, when you two write together, do you often write in the same room, or do you
Never.
send things back and forth? Never. Okay.
Cargill lives in Austin, and,
Right.
But one of the great things about historically about this, writing partnership is that Cargill's a real night owl. So when we really get revved up and really are full-time writing, he's writing all through the night and I'm writing all through the day. And it's like having a 24-hour writer, working around the clock on the script. It's great.
So who has the master draft? I mean, what happens when you both approach a scene differently?
It's funny. It's funny you ask that because we literally call it the master.
I'm already laughing. Here's the thing: when you swap material like that, it's very easy to get fucked up. It's very easy to suddenly be like, oh no, that was in the last draft, and I sent you this, but wait, this scene is so every single time we basically there's always one person who has the master draft. And every single subject line for who has the master has some funny version of "you have the master." It started off by just saying "you have the master," and that we would email it, and now it's down to things like mashed potatoes. It's like it'll just say that anything that has a masked sound to it, we know that means. I'm sending the master and you're receiving the master.
Here's a jar of mustard. It's
So were you typically writing the same scene, or was there ever a time when you were working in different parts of the actual story?
We work very linearly. We tend to pass it back and forth. We know where we're going. Sometimes one or the other of us we know when we're in a writing fit, we'll know a scene and we'll write it and set it aside. But we don't put it in the script yet. Because that just creates too much confusion. So typically what will end up happening is we have this very linear draft growing that we're passing back and forth. And then as you get to those scenes that you've set aside, you then work them in.
But we do often, I would say probably the most consistent thing in our writing partnership is the degree to which we really understand each other's strengths. There are times where, Cargill has the ability to write fully fleshed out scenes of dialogue that are so perfectly real and so dense with subtext that I still am astonished at times. Like the death of the Ancient One in Doctor Strange, Cargill wrote that scene. And it wasn't even a scene that we really talked much about. It just showed up in pages one day. And I was like, this is the greatest thing in any of our scripts ever.
Wow.
But he also understands, for example, I have a very visual mind as a director. I see things and I have kind of really unique abilities to translate visual ideas to the page. And sometimes Cargill will be in the middle of a flow of writing a section of the script. And then I'll get the draft and then it'll just have brackets in bold that just says, Scott's razzle dazzle right here.
Insert Scott Derrickson razzle dazzle here. Yeah.
No, that's great because a lot of writers do that. They use placeholder. Like they know what they need. Sometimes it's on a note.
We do that all the time with each other. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, so just one last creative habit question before we get into the spoilers soon, and it's going to be different for both of you. So just lightning fast. Do you prefer to give yourself a page count to hit each day when you're writing? Or a certain amount of hours, because writers kind of go back and forth, or do you not have any preference? Cargill, starting with you.
I'm a page count guy. I did it by hours previously and found that I got fewer pages out of it because I felt like I was locked into work. Whereas I could set a number of pages that I know that I could easily write in an hour. And that once I hit that, if it was a struggling day, then I could be like, hey, look, I got 3 pages done. That's great work. I can relax and recharge my brain for tomorrow and hit it again hard. But what ends up happening is you write 5 pages, you write 8 pages, because you get into that zone and you start writing and you're like, oh, I know what happens here. And next thing you know, you've written 25 pages in a night. But then the next day you don't go, oh, I wrote 25 pages yesterday. I don't have to do any work today. It's like, no, I have to hit those 3 again. And so, bare minimum, I'm churning out 15 pages a week. But what really happens is I get 20 to 30, 35 pages in a week.
Cargill is the fastest quality writer I've ever met, in terms of how the number of pages, good pages that he can churn out is pretty ridiculous.
That's fantastic because I've been interviewing writers for years and a lot of people use a marker of 5 pages, but 3 pages is so realistic that it makes you want to go beyond the 3 pages.
Yeah,
I love it.
He usually writes more than that, though.
Yeah,
I remember talking to Joe Hill about it because Joe and Cargill have been novel buddies for a long time. And the first time I met Joe, we were talking about Cargill, and I just made the comment about the speed with which he can churn things out. And Joe said, "Yeah, I can forgive him for how good he is. I'll never forgive him for how fast he is."
Well, so Scott, for you,
I'm very different. Cargill's a writer. He's a natural born writer. I'm a natural born director. And so writing is a trip to the dentist for me every time. It's just a painful, work process. And so my approach tends to be one where if I just don't feel any inspiration to write on a day, I usually won't. But most of the time when I realize, okay, I need to write, I can write today. That's about as inspired as I get. I usually will just go on a deep dive and really immerse myself in it. And then I'll write, and I will always if I do that, I always write until I just burn out, until I can feel diminishing returns in the actual writing process. And that usually happens after somewhere between 6 and 8 hours.
All right. Good to know. One thing that's not really a spoiler, because it's in the trailer, that I'm just going to ask in this section, because it's a shameful moment for both of you. And I must ask, as a lifelong magician, for shame, how could you have this serial killer as a magician? I know in the original story, the grabber was Al, and he was
Joe Hill's idea. Blame Joe. I blame Joe.
It's Joe's idea? Okay.
It was. After it had come out, it had come out. We had written the script, and he was a clown in Joe's short story, and Joe loved the script, and he just emailed us and goes, "You guys can't make him a clown now. You got to." And he was the one who suggested making him a magician, which, is great because he's still a performer, which I think adds to his sort of flamboyance and sort of dramatic gesturing and just, the way he is. It comes from that position.
And what Joe brought that we both were instantly connected with was, he was like, I've got this idea, because we were like, yeah, we'll change it from a clown. What do you want to do? And he goes, well, I've got this idea. There's this old school magician act that used to be done in the 30s and 40s. Oh God,
I forgot about this.
Where they would be a magician half the time and they would be playing the devil the other half of the time. And so they were the devil and the magician. They were the two sides of magic. And what if he was like that? And we went, well, that's fucking rad.
Yeah.
And we were like, hell yeah. And that's where Scott was like, oh, and we can do a devil mask. And that's where Scott went down this brilliant rabbit hole of coming up with the mask for this, what came out of Joe's suggestion of doing the devil and the magician. And he was so actually proud of it. Here's an Easter egg that people don't realize. He was so proud of that idea that he and his dad did this cool animated thing for Shudder for Halloween, where they took two of their short stories and had them animated. And they slipped in little comic pages in there. And Joe's comic page that he slipped in there is an advertisement for a magician devil act.
Oh, wow.
And it was a direct reference to the movie we had not made yet.
That's the first time I've heard that story. That's fantastic.
Awesome. Well, there is a code for magicians we would never kill. And the amazing Randy of the documentary An Honest Liar would go out and stop this killer. But I digressed. Tell us your budget and schedule before we get into the spoilers.
33 days and $17 million.
That's great. I mean, you owned it for that, especially those days with the effects. That's great. Well, so we are going to rush into the spoilers now. So if you have not yet seen Black Phone, please go see it in theaters. It is out. Wear a mask of your own, not a serial killer mask, and go to the theaters and see it with all your friends and family, because it's a fantastic film.
But it was important to us. The grabber still needs to have his face covered, so he's got either the face paint on or a mask.
So now we are going to get into the spoilers right off the bat. One of the most interesting things here is that we're hearing about a character we never see, their mother, and she had dreams that influenced her to do something. And Gwen also has dreams, and it's a very King family trope, I would say, for both of these writers that works out really well. Was there ever more revealed about the mother in any of your earlier scripts and that history?
No. It was really one of those things that was a great backstory that explains a lot. And Scott and I like to write densely. We like to have the stuff that you can put together. We don't explain the grabber in this movie, but once you watch the movie, you can put together kind of your own idea of why the grabber is who he is. And their mom was the same way, because she serves a wonderful purpose in that she not only explains, the origin of Gwen's abilities, but it also explains why their father is very much the way he is. And it also explains why Finney can hear the phone. Like, it's this wonderfully simple answer that gives us so much explanation in the story.
Right.
So once you know that, it all kind of just falls into place, and you don't go, well, wait a second, why this or that? Because we have her as the answer. I have a backstory in my head of who that is, because you always want to kind of generate that and do more work than you put on
Sure.
the page so you can answer those questions. But I never put that into the script because I didn't feel it needed to be there.
And we never talked about it either. You know, I mean, it was that we got pressure to put a backstory for the grabber into the movie after we test screened it twice. It screened very well. And the number one thing that the audience would say, you know, is there anything that you would do differently? Everybody was like, well, I want to know more about the grabber. And so, you know, there was a pressure put on to create some kind of backstory. And I just said, no, we're not doing that. I said, I love that they want to know more about him. That's good. You know, the best villains in this genre and just in genre filmmaking in general are mysteries. There's mystery to evil, you know.
Absolutely.
And it's like, I mean, Heath Ledger's the Joker, you know, when he says, you want to know how I got these scars? You know, the fact that he only tells lies and tells these stories that are, you know, can't all be true. Probably none of them are true. Just adds to the mystery, and that's more frightening. You know, I think if we knew, if there was a scene in Silence of the Lambs that told us why Hannibal Lecter eats people, it would ruin the movie.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to your setting in the 1970s, because obviously Darth Vader in Star Wars, you know, in episode 4, there's not as much about him. And they spent a lot of time afterwards explaining exactly who and why he is. But in that movie, not so much. And everybody was enthralled. Whereas, you know, flipping it on its head, Freddy Krueger, you know why he became Freddy Krueger. You don't understand all of his powers, but you understand how he was killed. I don't think that makes Freddy scarier. I think that works because that's the structure of the whole film is what is this? Absolutely.
What is this guy? What is this thing? When you're talking about a guy who, you know, a sadistic child killer, you know, we don't even say all the specific things that he does.
Right.
You have to infer them. But that's the frightening part, is that he's a real world character, and these guys like this are out there. They exist. And you know, the monsters that we know about, Ted Bundy had a good childhood. You know, Jeffrey Dahmer had nice parents. And so I think it also does a great disservice to a real world, a realistic grounded villain to try to, you know, David Mamet talks about the rubber ducky story that he feels like he's always asked to put in a movie, which is where you tell the story about when this character was a kid, somebody stole his rubber ducky, and that's how he became this person, you know, and that the audiences don't buy that most of the time.
Absolutely. Ooh, hey kids, I'm jumping in really quick to remind you that Backstory just turned 10. That's right. We've made it a decade. We're here. We've survived, and we couldn't have done it without your help. And, you know, we want to keep doing it. So your support means everything to us. And now is a perfect time to subscribe, because we just released our big summer issue. We also have not one, but 2 features on the Black Phone in the latest issue of Backstory. We have C. Robert Cargill and Scott Derrickson interviewed within the magazine, answering questions that are completely different from things that we talk about in this podcast. In our second article, we have an interview with novelist Joe Hill. That's right, the son of Stephen King, who wrote the short story, The Black Phone, which this film is, of course, based on. And I know you'll dig that interview as well. We have Emmy contenders ranging from Stranger Things, Barry, Better Call Saul, What We Do in the Shadows, Station 11, and Hacks. We also have summer movies. We have an interview with actor Glenn Powell, who plays Hangman in Top Gun Maverick. We have John Carpenter, the director of The Thing, on its 40th anniversary. Looking back, there are so many great articles to read in Backstories. Huge summer issue. There's also scripts to read. I know you'll dig it. If you've never read us before, you could, of course, test drive us by reading the free issue, which you could find at backstory.net on a desktop or laptop, or via our iPad app, Backstory. And look, after you check us out and test drive us, I hope you'll consider becoming a subscriber. And just to sweeten the deal, I want to offer you discount coupon code SAVE5. That's SAVE and the number 5, and that will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription. All you got to do is enter that code at backstory.net, and it'll get you access to both the iPad login and over at backstory.net on a desktop or laptop as well. Look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of all these Zoom casts. That's right. You could watch us do these interviews because they were Zooms that I've put on YouTube on the Backstory Magazine YouTube page. It would really mean a lot to me to have you support my passion project. So thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right back into our conversation with Cargill and Derrickson about writing their latest film, The Black Phone. You know, what was your biggest left turn? What was something that you played with on the page for a period of time that you absolutely never shot? It was discarded by the time production happened. But for a while, you really liked it as an idea. It was something really cool.
The original idea for this movie started with, I'd been in therapy for 3 years talking about traumatic events from my childhood and some of the violent things that I experienced. And I'm not going to go into the description of the scene now. It is really depressing. It's really grim, but it was, I wanted to make like an American 400 Blows, where, I love that movie. And it was Francis Truffaut's, sort of autobiographical story about his own childhood.
Yeah. And
there was one scene that was very dark and, a story involving that we would had Finney go through. And Cargill, was like, it was well written. It was very effective. And Cargill sort of sat on it, didn't say anything. And I think just waited for me, to come around. I was like, we got to pull this scene out. This scene is a bridge too far, in terms of the grimness of this kid's, home life. So we took it out. And as soon as we took it out, everything kind of popped. I think that was the last thing that had to be removed that made that first act sing.
Robert, is there something you want to mention that you can talk about?
No. I mean, it was very much that scene. It was the thing is we wrote it. It worked. But I shared it with my wife, who's a huge horror fan. She's actually a bigger horror fan than I am. And she was just like, no, that's too far. You can't do that. And she never does that. Like, that's not a thing that she ever does to me with my writing. And I've gone pretty far before. She just felt that it was too far. And so, when Scott was finally like, I think we should pull it, I'm like, yeah, I'm feeling that too. So, that was really the one thing. Aside from that, there wasn't much else because Scott really did give me a very good, very structured outline that we worked from. And that became the movie.
We interviewed you for Backstory Magazine as well. And we had some great stuff about Scott talking about how his childhood influenced some of these things. And I'm gonna leave that to our listeners to discover in Backstory. I want to talk about what I think one of the triumphs of the movie is. The scourge for all writers is dealing with exposition. And you have a lot of ground to cover in this film. The toughest scenes were in the basement because once you realize that it's the ghost kids talking to him through the phone and that because of his family's history, he's able to hear it, you're wondering, how could you keep it interesting? And you managed to keep it interesting every single time, whether it's they're in the same room using a phone voice, even though they're in the same room, they're seen, they're not seen, they're floating, they're reenacting part of their own deaths. I mean, it was amazing. Tell us about some of the challenges of making sure that those scenes popped, because I mean, it is the glue of the movie.
I mean, it's a haunted house movie, but it's a haunted basement. Like, we get to do all the stuff we would normally do in a horror movie. We're in there. Really, the big idea, the big cheat, what we used, our cheat code for this movie to keep it going, was the ability to leave the basement and go be with Gwen, and to be able to transition from ghost stories into Gwen's dreams. And so whenever we knew we needed to get out to catch a breath or move time forward, we could go rejoin Gwen on her search and then come back 8 hours later with Finney and not have to explain that transition of time.
Right.
And so it really was a great cheat code to be able to keep everything fresh down there and give that room to breathe for those scenes to work. Because the biggest thing about horror is you cannot pack it all together. You can't do 5 scary things in a row. You have to take a moment to catch your breath. You need to reset the audience with a laugh or do something so that horror keeps coming back and keeps being scary. If you overload it, the audience just shuts down. And so being able to go and visit Gwen and spend time with her allowed us to do that.
And a lot of that backstory is visual because, most of what we learn about those kids, we learn through her dreams, through just watching it happen.
Right.
And so these little Super 8 dreams are visual backstory, and that was another breakout theme.
And it was a fantastic visual as well. But I mean, again, the triumph of the movie occurs through this realization, as you said earlier, that the short story is almost like an act 2. Well, the act 2, when the hero figures out that things aren't going their way, is when you realize in the movie, Finn realizes, sorry, I should say, that all these kids giving him very confident, directed advice of how to escape are actually ending with their failures, meaning that they've died. They made it to a certain point trying each of these different escape routes, and none of them was successful. But fascinatingly, in the third act, the culmination of all of this advice from this, camaraderie with these dead ghosts is what saves Finn and allows him to triumph. And that was really interesting to see develop. That seems like the engine.
I think that's the best thing about the screenplay, other than the character work. And I think that there's a few people who've seen the movie who, weren't paying enough attention. And because I've heard a few, the responses I've heard is some people will be like, just the ending doesn't really add up to anything. In which case I'm like, oh, you missed it.
Wow.
Each mission wasn't about him getting out. He was never getting out. He was going to have to go through the grabber to get out. It was about giving him the material that he needed to have that final fight. Because in the final fight, he uses every piece of material that's given to him by each of the ghost kids. That was the plan. That was the sort of divinely orchestrated mystery behind the whole thing. And we didn't want to hang a lantern on that too far, but people, the reactions are either like, wow, the way it all pays off in the end is incredible, or they kind of miss that. And if you miss that, you miss, I think, maybe the best thing about the movie.
It was really incredible. Kudos to you on layering it in such a fashion that it wasn't so obvious.
And we could have made it more obvious, and we just didn't want to. And I think, interestingly enough, the people who didn't get it were pretty astute critics. Film critics. And I'm just thinking of like two people in particular, both of who I know and are really good dudes and good critics. But I think that there's something about this genre,
right,
that a lot of film critics sort of they don't analyze or study or expect that kind of sort of subtle density of storytelling. And so, there's more of it's a horror film, I'm just going to sit back and let it happen.
Right. But you see the police trying to put it together, and so is Finn. So, yeah, Finn is trying to solve it himself. And that's what is the engine. I just want to talk about the rule of the phone for a second. At one point, the grabber mentions that he's heard the phone ring once, I believe was my note that I wrote down. Was there ever more interplay with how much the grabber could or couldn't hear, or even if he could hear the voices of this disconnected phone in a basement?
Not particularly. I mean, the thing is that we do say that, we mentioned that he tells the story that he's heard it ring. They mention to him that he can hear it, but he doesn't want to. So he's deliberately not listening for it. He doesn't want to hear it. Whereas Finn is actively listening for it. And, Finn clearly has half of the gift that his mother had. Gwen got half of it and he got half of it in different directions. And so
I think Gwen got like 89% of it and he got like 11.
Right. She got a lot for sure, especially by the time she's with Vance, in the car. So, yeah. I mean, that was incredible. Speaking of the whole ending, that needle drop for On the Run from Pink Floyd was genius. Very briefly, because I know we're going to start running out of time and I got another question or two. When did you realize that would just match up, or did you know in editing before you even started assembly?
No, I didn't know that we would get the rights. Wasn't planning to use that song. It was shot as a montage. Obviously, everything that it covers. I knew it would be a music montage. I was hoping that I would find a good 70s needle drop to use there. And I knew that if that didn't work, we would use score. But I must have tried. Oh man, I must have tried 150 songs.
What was in second place?
Really nothing. Everything else that I tried, I tried a lot of different things too before settling on Fox on the Run for the 7-Eleven fight for Vance Hopper's character in that flashback sequence. We also used Heartbreaker by Led Zeppelin. That song was awesome. They wanted $500,000 for it. And I was like, wow. You guys are idiots, $500,000 to introduce Heartbreaker to new generations of listeners. So I said, no, I just rejected that. I told the producers, don't even think about paying that. We're not paying that. But
it's a great song if you have the money.
It's an awesome song, but those guys need to get over themselves. But for Pink Floyd, I kept trying things over and over and over again, and nothing was really had any magic. And as soon as I dropped On the Run in, it was like, and it almost perfectly matched the editing as it was. I had to make some adjustments to make it a little bit tighter, but it immediately was. And the last thing I'll say is those guys, Pink Floyd, gave us a cut rate because we normally wouldn't be able to afford that track. It's from Dark Side of the Moon. It's from maybe the most iconic album of the 70s.
Yeah.
And I fancy the idea that they like us because we had Vincent D'Onofrio wearing a Pink Floyd shirt in Sinister, and then for Doctor Strange, they sent the message back when we paid for Interstellar Overdrive, and they said, "We're really excited that you're using something from the Sid Barrett era from their first album."
Right.
And so when I asked for this, I said, tell them this is all we can afford. And they were like, done. They just gave it to us.
That's awesome.
And I'm really appreciative because I do think that needle drop works magically.
I know we're running out of time, so I'll get to the final question. And just one thing I want to say that I loved about our article and backstory, Scott, of what you talked about is, that Gwen's abusive relationship, her father abusing her, which you showed really bearingly, is what gives her the strength and the courage for the rest of the movie to look at these other horrors, because the horrors of what she's enduring at home are so realistic that
they're so realistic. Yeah, and it's amazing. and I love how in that scene, she's fighting in that scene. She, when we meet her, she's getting whipped, but then she takes the bottle and she's like, you hit me again, I'm dropping it. And just love her ferocity. In which case he throws her on the floor, goes crazy. And when she comes up, she's really broken and she's weeping. Yeah. But my favorite moment of acting in the whole movie, and I didn't direct her to do this, is when Jeremy Davies, her father, tells her 3 times, say it again. And she's like, my dreams are just dreams. And tears pouring down her face, say it again. My dreams are just dreams. And he's like, say it again. And something snaps in her. And that's how well Madeline McGraw, the actress, understood the character. And she gets defiant.
Just amazing.
And she says, my dreams are just dreams. And she like snaps back at him. Jeremy was surprised. It's in the movie. Like he wasn't expecting that. And it plays, in that scene that the father was like, and that sort of shuts everything down. Yeah. And then it all calms down. He's like, get out and throws him out. And
just an amazing scene.
That just shows who she is, that, it doesn't matter how hard or how difficult it is. She's going to keep fighting. That's just her nature.
Well, lightning question for you. So, Scott, it's a little more difficult for you, but we'll start with Cargill to give you a second to think about it. It's just, what was your toughest scene? So, Cargill on the page, but Scott both as a writer and a director. So, Cargill, starting with you, what was your toughest scene? The one that you remember coming back to over and over again on the page, and how did you creatively rise to the challenge?
The hardest scene to write was the one I think we fiddled around with the most, weirdly, is the scene in which their father gets the phone call from the phone tree and has the conversation has to tell his son, that their friend, his friend has been taken. And we just, unlike so much of the script fell into place. And me and Scott went back on that scene 4 or 5 times, just trying to get the length of the scene right, trying to get the information there. And it's in the movie, it's just a very simple scene now. But we did play around with multiple iterations of that.
It's a great scene. Scott, on the page and then as a director.
On the page, I think Cargill's right. I think that's the scene that we messed around with the most. I remember struggling a lot with that. And with the really that scene, Jeremy Davies' conversation with Gwen, and then his reunion with them at the end, getting the tone right for those was very difficult. It's very bad. You don't want him to be forgiven at the end, but you also don't want him to be rejected. All of that was tricky. Yeah. For me, directorially, the most difficult thing and the thing I had my eye on the most had to do with Finney in the first act. Finney, specifically him in the first act, because he's getting bullied. He's got this abusive father. All these bad things are happening to him. And it would be very, very easy. And I've seen this happen for that kid to play moments of self-pity and to start to be self-pitying about even in the baseball scene, he's set up to be the hero. Instead, he throws the pitch and Bruce Yamada hits the home run. And like how he responded, even in that scene, the thing I realized before we shot, which I had an eye on all the way through the movie, and especially in the first act, but all the way through the movie and everything with the grabber, is he has to suffer a lot of pain. He has to go through a lot. Everything that happens to him is hard. It's difficult. And yet, if you have a kid in a movie who feels sorry for himself, no one wants to see it. No one cares about a kid who he had every right to feel sorry for himself. But that became a real balancing act for me as a director, to allow him to feel the pain of the events that were befalling him, and to feel the fear of the grabber, to feel the anxiety of his situation, and to save the self. And the strategy was like, let that strength be present all the time so that we like him, because he's a fighter. He endures, he can take a lot, and save it all for that moment when he can't get out of the freezer. And when he can't get out of the freezer, then it's just like, let it go. And that's why I told Mason, I said, you got to really cry on this day. And he was very nervous about it. He said, I'm going to need like 5 minutes to prepare for that. I was like, fine, but that's the only time that he just slinks into the corner and cries. And, and because it's too much. He doesn't think he's kind of at the point of giving up then. And that's a point where you feel pity for him. You feel bad for him, but I couldn't let him feel sorry for himself before that, because if I had done that, I think the audience would not root for him the way they do.
It's funny because it's organic to your movie, because every time that there would be a moment of self-pity or loathing, the phone rings and he's encouraged.
Yeah, it's really true.
He's encouraged by one of the ghosts.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is about fighting through the horrors of life. And that's what I loved about it. You guys did a fantastic job with this film. Could there be a sequel? Is that something you would even consider?
Yeah, for sure. Joe Hill's got an idea for a black phone too that's quite good. So well, you never know. We'll see.
I absolutely love your movie and love your script. Robert, Scott, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks
for
having us.
And that's how the Q&A went down. Special thanks again to co-writer C. Robert Cargill and co-writer director Scott Derrickson for being so generous with their time and coming down to chat about their latest film, The Black Phone. Of course, while you're surfing around online, I hope you also check out Backstory Magazine. We just turned 10, folks. We lasted a decade, and we couldn't have done it without your support. And we just published our huge summer issue. It has Emmy contenders ranging from Stranger Things, Barry, Better Call Saul, Hacks, What We Do in the Shadows, and Station 11. We have actor Glenn Powell, who plays Hangman in Top Gun Maverick, talking about what it was like to be in that incredible film and his process. And, he's also a screenwriter. There's scripts to read in Backstory. There's also an interview with director John Carpenter on the 40th anniversary of The Thing. And folks, I would be remiss if I did not mention that we have not one but two articles on The Black Phone in the latest issue, including Derrickson and Cargill, talking about things that we did not talk about in this podcast. Yes, that was by design, because we knew we had the article in the magazine covering some different stuff. So if you're a fan of the film, you're going to want to check out the magazine for that reason too. In our second article, we have an interview with novelist Joe Hill. That's right, the son of Stephen King, who wrote the short story, The Black Phone, which this film is, of course, based on. And I know you'll dig that interview as well. There's so many great pieces in our summer issue, and we're continuing to add to it. So it would be fantastic to have you as a subscriber. And of course, to sweeten the deal, if you want to subscribe now, you could use discount coupon code SAVE5. That's SAVE and the number 5, and that will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription to Backstory. You just enter that code into the shopping cart at backstory.net, and it will give you access to both the iPad app and the website. So look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where all these Zoomcasts go. That's right. These are Zoom interviews. So you could watch us have these discussions on the Backstory Magazine YouTube page. It would really mean a lot to me to have you consider supporting my passion project. So thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. The Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith podcast is a copyright of Unlikely Films Incorporated in 2022. All rights reserved. Folks, if you want to find me on social media, you could always find me as Yo Goldsmith on Twitter or Backstory_mag on Twitter. You could also find those same accounts on Instagram. So Yo Goldsmith on Instagram or Backstory_mag on Instagram. You could check out our Facebook fan page, or you could even send us an email at backstoryletters@gmail.com. That inbox gets a little cluttered sometimes, so I apologize if I don't respond immediately, but I love hearing what folks have to say, and I promise you I will do my darndest to get to your message. I'm Jeff Goldsmith, the publisher of Backstory Magazine and the host of the Q&A, thanking you for tuning in and telling you to stay out of trouble. Till next week.